Go. We
Hey,
are.
good evening and welcome to Eastland Christian Church Wednesday night Bible study, Digging Deeper. I want to welcome everybody here on this day, June 2nd, 2021. Um, I think about that and I feel a little bit old. But anyway, we are here. I'm here with William. He's making an adjustment on the technology. I want to welcome everybody to our study in the book of Judges as we go in. Um, as always, excuse me, we're going to open with a word of prayer. And, for those of you who are members, if you have the list of prayer requests, please remember those people in prayer. Are we working? Okay. Keep going, he says. All right. And in just a minute, William will join me up here and we can start. Also, we want to let everybody know that our Wednesday night Bible study is open for a live audience. If you want to come out and join us on Wednesday evening, you can fire questions at me or, make comments, pick on me or whatever, up close and personal like. But we'd enjoy to have you here. I always like having people that I can talk to and interact with personally when we're doing these studies, because it keeps me on my toes and it helps everybody. Also with a little fellowship. So that said, let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started in our continuation in our study on the book of Judges in the Old Testament. Father God, thank you for this day you've given us, for the rains that have watered your earth, Lord. For the flowers in the spring, Lord, and the promise of new life that it reminds us of, the new life we have for you. Father God, we thank you that we are able to study your word tonight, that we can do this without fear of retribution or oppression in this nation, when so many nations, peoples don't have this opportunity. We pray that our words would be edifying and empowering, Lord, and encouraging to those who are listening, and that your word would flow through us. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So William is here now. We are working properly. Oh, yeah.
It would help if I turned on my mic. Okay. So I was saying before I realized that I wasn't actually saying anything. Just a shout out to Chris Crabtree. He had surgery on Monday.
Yep.
For his knee. He's in recovery. It went well. So if you'll just pray for him and his family, just for a quick recovery, and to remember that in your prayers. But yeah, Judges chapter 3.
Right.
We're starting to get into the list of superheroes that is the book of Judges. And we start tonight with our buddy Othniel, and then we'll move on to Ehud. And then, as you said earlier, if we have time, we'll talk about Shamgar.
Yep.
Shamgar. I didn't say that right.
Nope. You said it like I always say it, Shagmar.
I'm sure there are many names that I will mispronounce.
Oh, yeah.
In the old Hebrew transliterations that we're dealing with here,
Yep.
In terms of their names, it's going to be a little rough. But Judges, this book it's tremendous. Right? We've already set up the overlook of it, which is the Hebrew people did not do what God had asked them to do, and so
they started that downward spiral.
Yep, and that spiral is also circular, because
right.
That's
you just kept going around and around. And
that's
every
what's
going to
happen with this.
It got a little lower.
As they're gonna disobey God, and then God is gonna save them through a judge, and then they're gonna come back to God, and then they're gonna disobey God, and then that process is going to repeat itself for 380 years. It is extreme.
Until it hits the bottom,
Yep.
where the Hebrew people who were called out to be separate and different and be God's people want a king just like everybody else
Yep.
has a king. So effectively they are going to reject God as their king
Yep.
for an earthly king. And
at the start of Judges, you actually see this, that God is their king.
God is
you
their
see
king.
this at the
And
start of Judges, and it definitely, through the world's influence and everything else, they lose track of that. And they think that they need an earthly king, and that's definitely not the case here.
and while God doesn't reject them for their disobedience, in Judges we actually see a beginning of a disconnect of a God who calls them my people, whom I've called, to just back in chapter 2 and verse 20, the Lord is very angry with Israel, and he says, he doesn't say because my people, he says because this nation. And so we're already starting to see a disconnect. God is still keeping his covenant. God still loves his people. But now there's a separation because of the sin and the disobedience that's in there. And that separation is a result of that sin and disobedience. And going then into chapter 3, in the first part of chapter 3, the Lord decides that because they didn't do what they're supposed to do from the get-go, which was get everybody else out of Canaan completely, totally, 100%, that they started making compromises. He left remnants in there to test them and to see what they were going to do. And of course, right away, what happens in verse 5 is they live among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, and all the otherites.
All the otherites.
As I always say, and all the itites that are in this land. And they take their daughters in marriage. They gave their own daughters to their sons. And they serve their gods. And of course, what happens then is this outside influence of, see, they're supposed to be changing the world around them, and the world ends up changing them. And the influences of the world come in and start corrupting them because the Canaanite daughters are marrying the Hebrew boys, and they're bringing their own personal household gods and stuff in. And it just starts spiraling down, and it gets worse. And you know, this Canaanite religions was all about, you know, an agrarian economy, you know, fertility for the animals and for crops and everything else. And so they did everything they could to try and get their God's attention to you know, ensure this facility for fertility and prosperity. And you know, it got down even to, you know, child sacrifices and human blood and I mean, it's a really bad deal. It's a mess.
Yeah.
And the Israelites start falling into this. So we get to Othniel, the first judge.
First judge.
In chapter 3, verse 7. And you want me to read this part?
Yeah, why not?
I'll go ahead. So the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the Asherahs. And these are the family group of Baal was the male god that represented power and thunder and fertility, and Asherah was the mother earth goddess, fertility and stuff. And they worshiped them, and and they're all different versions of them, and that's why you see it in the plural here.
Right.
But it was all come down to pretty much the same thing with little different versions here and there. And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, so that he became Israel judge and went to war. And the Lord gave Cushan, whatever, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Othniel's a neat person here, the son of Kenaz, because if we go back earlier in the book, we can read about him in chapter 1, and as the Israelites are advancing against the people living in Debir, Caleb says, I will give my daughter Aksa in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sefer. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it, so Caleb gave his daughter Aksa to him in marriage. And so here we have actually a hero here who actually did something, and who was still, he was probably fairly old at this point, was one of those who had seen what God could do in the early days of the conquest. I mean, he was a nephew of Caleb. Caleb and Joshua being the only two who left Egypt who made it to the promised land.
Yep. This would also make him experienced in the ways of war.
Oh,
as
yeah.
well.
Yeah. And so the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and he becomes Israel's judge, and he goes to war. And in my commentary, the translation for Cushan's, the last half of that name is basically, how did they call it? He's a dictator. He's actually bad.
The Rishathaim. Is that what you're saying? The last half of that name?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, come on. How did he say it? It was really good. It was like Cushan, the bully, or the
Well, that's appropriate, because that's what would be
which is what he did, because
essentially all of the other leaders that take over the Israelite people. They basically are bullies.
they're dictators. They
Yes.
are oppressors, and part of the problem here, what has happening is the Israelites kind of developed this attitude. Well, look, all this stuff that's going around us, it's not really that bad, and what these religions do in some of these things. So, and we can do this, and it's not that big of a deal, and everything else. And, these rules that God or Yahweh has put down are really restrictive, and it's like, I want to be free. So, I want to be free to do what I want. Well, the problem is, when you're free to do what you want, the only way to keep law and order is to have a dictator. And so this is what happens. This is what would happen, and now they're being oppressed, and all their stuff is, their produce is being taken and stuff, and they're groaning under this, and they're complaining under this because now this Cushan, he comes in and he goes, well, there's got to be some order around here, so, hey, I'll just fill the void and do it my way.
Yeah.
And these people can be free to do whatever they want as long as they do what I tell them. And this is what happens. And we'll see this later on in the chapters. We'll see the phrase, everybody did what was right in their own eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of sounds familiar today in our country, doesn't it?
I think that sounds familiar for the human race.
For the human race. And when that happens, it's called anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And the only way to stop anarchy, then, without God's moral law and seeking it and filling that and obeying that, is by having a dictator. In the 19th century, Nietzsche, published, he's this big German philosopher, hey, I killed God. God is dead. And they took God out. And then what started happening when you got God out of German society and everything as a whole and started distancing from that, all kinds of different things started happening. And the ultimate result was Hitler coming to power. And the results that happened from that. And you still see it over there, and then you saw it with the rise of Marxism, and ultimately what went on under the Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union and in a lot of other countries.
What we learn, especially through history, and if we would count for modern history, so World War II, that era and stuff, and we count for ancient history, what we learn is that without God, basically man cannot be trusted in his own to govern himself.
That is
right?
correct.
That's what we
learn.
learn.
There's God gives us our moral absolute boundaries, and well, we're a moral people. We don't need God. Well, time out. If where do your morals come from then, and who sets them, and what is the standard for society? And if everybody has their own view of it, everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes.
I was reading this today in Romans chapter 1. If anybody listening out there has not read Romans chapter 1,
oh yeah,
it basically talks about the sin, like how sin has corrupted the world and it's corrupted human beings. And this is exactly what what you're talking about here is that it's just, look, it comes down to humans are sinful people, and because we're sinful people, we're always going to look out for number one, and number one on the sin chart is me. And that's what we're going to do. And so for a time, we can definitely do something benevolent. We can do good things. We can, but when it comes down to it, we will always give in to the sinful nature. Paul says this in Romans 5, is that, right, he has two laws in work in him that are always fighting for control.
Right, yes.
The law of good and the law of evil. And he, in his sinful nature, always wants to do what's best for him and always to do what is sinful. And that's kind of what this comes down to, is that this history that we're reading here in Judges is essentially that, is that the Hebrew people are dealing with individuals and countries outside their own that don't know, and, well, God has made himself known regardless of what people think, right? You mentioned
Paul says that
in Romans 1.
In Romans 1, his invisible nature.
And you kind of hinted at that
through all things.
Where you said, well, we're moral people. Where do your morals come from? People misappropriate that to themselves when that intrinsic moral aptitude comes from God himself, and he gives it to us as his creation. This is part of what it means that we are made in his image, is that we have certain characteristics of God within us. He ingrained us in that way. But what we see from the Hebrew people here over and over again, you kind of hinted at it earlier, is that they're going to see basically good things happen to bad people.
Yes.
And so what they're going to do is they're going to rationalize that in their head, and they're going to think, well, if good things are happening to them and they're doing these evil things, well, then they must not be that bad, because surely if they were that bad, then God would punish them. And that's been one of the theologies of the Hebrew people for recorded history, is this idea that God punishes the wicked and those who are righteous. This is basically the book of Job, right?
Yeah.
This is
yes.
the argument in the book of Job.
In the book of Job.
Is that his friends come to him and they say, well, all this bad stuff happened to you because
you did something wrong.
You're a sinner.
You need to own up to it.
And that was, this is what has led the Hebrew people astray for a very long time, is that they don't just see the consequence of death and suffering in the world because of sin. Instead, they believe that death and suffering is a result of you actually performing sin, not because sin simply exists. And this has led them astray, and it will continue to lead them astray within the book of Judges over and over again.
Right. So what happens here is then God sells them into the hands of these oppressors, in this case Cushan, of king of Aram, and they're subject for 8 years. And
that doesn't seem like such a long time.
Doesn't seem like a long time, but they cry out to the Lord. See, it only took them 8 years to cry out to the Lord.
This time.
And he gives them a deliverer, Othniel, who is, probably sat with his uncle Caleb and learned a few things about what happened. And, Othniel might even have been one of those that crossed into the Jordan there at Jericho. I mean, if he was Caleb's nephew.
Well, the Bible doesn't really tell us.
I
think you can assume that Othniel is probably a great general within the Israelite people.
Oh, yeah.
He is accustomed to war. He knows what he's doing within it. And I would probably even equate him to like one of David's mighty men. Is he has probably done and seen some just insane battle and campaigns.
Sure.
And this is one of the reasons he's the first judge, is that he is definitely qualified for this to rout these people out.
He's qualified, yes. And it says in verse 10, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him.
What else more does he need?
And he's open to it, and he's listening to it. And he's probably one of the few in Israel that was still probably following the ways of God because of his heritage, and just one generation removed from Joshua or Caleb, and so he goes to war and he defeats the king of Aram, and so the land has peace now for 40 years under his leadership. And then the telling verse is, in verse 11, the last part of it, until Othniel the son of Kenaz died. And at that point, now there's a vacuum.
Yeah.
And the vacuum that should be filled by God and his commandments and obedience to them is now empty, and nature abhors a vacuum. So whatever else to come in there to fill that is now coming in, and it's allowed to come in again, just like at the start.
Yep.
And only this time, it's a little worse.
Yep. Well, there's this interesting language here in verse 11. So the land had peace for 40 years. So
Yeah.
after Othniel had driven out this king, the land saw peace. Right? There wasn't war. There wasn't the strife that had been a part of the land for so long. When Othniel was in charge, things kind of calmed down for a little bit, and then they had peace for 40 years, and that peace sort of led to
prosperity,
and
that which led to apathy.
Yep. And not that those things are bad. We certainly seek peace. We seek prosperity.
Right.
But the problem is that God is not the pillar of those things in this society in what it should be. Because when God is in the pillar, I think we talked about this last week, everything else falls in place.
Yes.
And so if God is the pillar, the forefront of the Israelite people, then they have peace. If he is the pillar, then they have prosperity. If he's the pillar, then they have generations of their family that are growing up in good and righteous ways. And all these things fall in place if God is the center of the universe. But unfortunately, he just not. He is for a time, and then it fades away. And
you get what I always used to say: fat, dumb, and happy.
Which leads us into our next judge.
Yep, it really does.
This is one of my favorite Bible accounts.
This is the irregular. This is like the guerrilla war type guy.
Ehud. And I was reading up on this story before we came here, and I was just laughing. And Angela was wondering why I was laughing. It's because the language that's in this story is something else. So I want to warn you all before we read into it that there's some gross things that happen within this historical account. So prepare yourself. Here we go. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Again, they did evil.
Once again.
And because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel. Getting the Amorites and the Amalekites to join him, Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. This is also Jericho. The Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjamite. The Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about a cubit long. This is, like a foot and a half, I believe? Yeah. Which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. This is why I was laughing, is because the language is so just matter of fact.
Yep.
After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone images, nor Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you. The king said to his attendees, Leave us! And they all left. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, I have a message from God for you. And as the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. Then Ehud went out to the porch. the porch.
Out on the porch.
Just the way that sounds. Now, to be fair, that word, we don't know what the real Hebrew translation for that word is, so it's just guessed porch.
He went out the back door.
Basically.
Or the window.
Yes. So he shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. And after he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said, "He must be relieving himself in the upper room of the palace." They waited to the point of embarrassment. How much time is that? I want to know.
Yeah.
But when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their Lord fallen to the floor dead. While they waited, Ehud got away. He passed by the stone images and escaped to Sarah. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills, with him leading them. "Follow me," he ordered, "for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands." So they followed him down and took possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab. They allowed no one to cross over. At that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. Not one escaped. That day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the Lord had peace, and the land, had peace for 80 years. Ehud. This story just makes me
He's like
smile.
me. He's a lefty.
This story makes me smile so much. And it's because I'm childish. That's why it makes me smile, because the king messes himself, and it's just language like that that's, I don't know. Like I said, I'm childish, which is why I will probably laugh while we're going through this. So some important things to note. You mentioned it, is that he's a left-handed man.
He's a lefty. And I'm going to stand up and I'm going to demonstrate this real quick.
That's why you were messing with your cane.
That's why I was messing with my cane, okay?
You better not fall down.
The average person, most of everybody is right-handed, okay? So this is their sword hand.
Yeah, the best of us are right-handed.
And yes, but we're in our right mind.
That's an excuse you made up to make yourself feel better.
No, that is a fact. I use the right side of my brain. And this would be the shield arm. And so to draw your sword, the sword is always worn on the left side so you could draw it out. And what would happen is when you were wearing your long robes or whatever and carrying your sword, and you would go into the king, the guards would come over and they would pat you down on your left side and take your sword, okay? Because you're not going to draw your sword like this. It's too difficult. So Ehud, being left-handed, takes the sword, and it's going to be just a little bit shorter than this, and he straps it to his right thigh. So when he goes in, of course, to see the king, the guards are going to pat down his left side, and there's nothing there. So that's how he gets in. And then he pulls out his sword, which is just a little shorter than this. And he says, even the handle went in after.
Mm-hmm.
So he's got this thing, and he actually sticks it all the way through him.
You better watch yourself.
I'm watching. And then leaves it there. Let's go, leaves it. I'm sure he had to wipe his hand off because it said the fat of his belly closed in over the... Now, you think about this. This dude is fat. If you could put a sword like this all the way through him and bury it.
This speaks to the debauchery of Eglon.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It speaks to the debauchery of his people.
The gluttony and everything that they were doing, and
Yes.
and so. But this is what makes Ehud a neat guy, because left-handed people weren't, and in those societies in the Middle East,
still aren't,
are still
I'm
not accepted. In Latin, you're sinister because you're left-handed. That's the term for being left-handed, is sinister.
Yeah, it's kind of a superstitious thing throughout ancient history. similar to like people with red hair,
Right.
and things like that. Like there was a superstitious following about those who are different than the majority of people. That maybe something was wrong with them, and many times people attributed it to either curses from the gods or maybe some kind of magical thing or other things like that. So it is an interesting thing that Ehud is used here.
Is used by God. It's an irregular. In my commentary, he calls him one of God's irregulars, and so God doesn't use the regular, normal, what you would think a person. So
Yes.
you know, and you can imagine this. You know, you got all these people. Like, say, if you have an army who are right-handed, and then here's one guy who's got his shield in the wrong hand and his sword on the wrong side.
You'd think he's a dummy.
And, you know, it's like, you know, you're the drill sergeant or the commander there, and you're looking at your troops, and you got one guy that's like this. You're going to have some words for him, right?
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So here's Ehud. He's an irregular, and he comes up with this. And then you got Eglon, who's this debauched, really super fat king, and who Ehud says, I have a message for you from God, who is so what's the word I want to use? Drunk on himself.
Yep.
Okay. With you know, his own vanity and glory and everything. Of course, you know, he's huge. Wow, God's got a message for me personally.
Yeah, everybody
so he
get
kicks
out.
everybody else out.
Yep.
And now he's left alone with Ehud, who, yeah, I got to tell you this, but I got to kind of whisper it to you. So instead of, you know, staying away, he tells us, Ehud gets up and walks over to him. Oh, I got to hear this. What's God got to say to me? And it's like,
Die.
oh.
Die. Your message is death.
And of course,
yeah, he stabs him. And there's actually a couple of things that lend itself towards showing us, right? Because the Bible, when it's telling history, sometimes it doesn't do a very good job of fleshing out exactly what was going on here. But we can kind of pick up little pieces and really surmise what is happening here. So first off, the Moabites, they're not great people historically, and he is the king of them. And then secondly, we do see the sort of like the way that it just talks about him being so big and the sword getting like sucked into him and stuff like that. Like it's trying to draw this picture to show you that Eglon is just a disgusting guy. Like he is I think debauchery is the right word. Is that there is no pleasure
he's the scum of the earth
in his presence that he's not willing to undertake. Right. And so after Ehud stabs him and the sword gets sucked into him, you know, we see that he loses his bowels.
Yep.
And so, sorry, I'm so childish.
But if you think about it now,
when someone dies, this is science.
This is science. That's what happens.
They lose themselves. It's just because the muscles in your body give out. They
all relax.
Right. And so what's keeping all that stuff inside of us is the muscles inside of our body. And when you die, they go, right? Now, for it to be so noticeable would mean that Eglon, again, just he's stuffing himself. He's gorging himself for it to be something that's so noteworthy to be recorded in history. Because, right, everybody does this. So when Othniel kills the other king, right? This guy did that. But this particular story, it's taken note of. And that's to show us just how much Eglon just indulged in all that other stuff.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then it's interesting that his servants come up to the door, and the door is locked, and they're like, oh, well, he just must be just going to the bathroom wherever he wants to then, I guess.
Or he has a chamber pot up there.
Or he has a chamber pot up there. I like to think that because it's the upper palaces of his room and they made note of it, that it was distinct. That's what I like to think.
Probably just wherever he was.
Right.
And had some slave come and clean it up.
I think that was because note is made of it by his servants. And then they wait to the time of embarrassment. And that language is so interesting to me because if they think that he's using the bathroom, how long do they give him? It's enough time for Ehud to climb down and escape. That's for sure. So I don't know. I wish I had insight into what the time of embarrassment is, but just his servants waiting outside going, well, he's going to unlock the door soon to let everybody else back in.
Yeah.
Right? So, and here's another reason why I don't think it's a chamber pot. It's because all his attendants were in there, and he sent them out. Like, I don't know. People were waiting to get back in there. I don't necessarily think that. Anyway.
Well, in either case, I mean,
I'm dwelling too much on
my commentary
this.
here says, Ehud would have, and I like this when I was studying it, principal target of irony is his physique would presumably have done credit to a sumo wrestler.
Okay.
Okay. So he's grown fat on the tribute he's been exacting from Israel. His greed has made him vulnerable. And this is funny. Certainly there's no shortage for a target for Ehud to aim at.
Low blow. Low blow.
I mean, this is what it is.
We're having too much fun with this story.
We are. And I mean, so here's a guy, I'm telling you what, if you can hit the broadside of a barn, that was Eglon.
Dan Short said like Jabba the Hutt.
Well, yeah, Jabba the Hutt. That's how Dan Shorts described him.
Pretty much.
And here comes Ehud in, who's left-handed, and they only check his left side to make sure there's no weapons there. Mm-hmm. And the king is gullible. Okay. He says, I got a special message for you. And the king goes, from God? Oh, wow, that's so cool. I want to hear what God's special message for me is. It's like, I must really be good if the gods have a special message for me.
Well, they also Trojan horsed him, right?
Oh,
they brought in a tribute to him.
They brought him this tribute
to King Eglon the Great. May your reign last forever. So he doesn't suspect anything at all from
and he's
Ehud.
so full of himself, and he's all right. And then he sets himself up. Well, he's got a person here who just brought a tribute in, and what's he do? He sends all his advisors and his buddies out the door.
Yep.
And then closes the door.
Mm-hmm.
And then he gets up out of his throne or whatever he's sitting on, and he walks up to him.
Yeah.
Now, if he'd stayed setting up on the throne, Ehud probably wouldn't have been able to reach him.
Yeah, right.
Right? But no, he comes down to talk to him. I mean, this guy is like, nothing's going to happen to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And boom. And then Ehud goes over and he very calmly locks the door and goes out the back window and away.
Yeah. And then in another one of those details that by telling history that the Bible kind of leaves out is Ehud goes and he summons an army. So, right, this doesn't just happen. Like,
Mm-mm.
Ehud, the way, if you read it literally, it sounds like Ehud went up to a hill, blew a horn, all Israel heard him,
And was there.
and then just was there at the moment's notice. And that's not how wars happen. This is something that has been coming for a while, right?
Right.
Ehud fashions this sword. He is the one that is like, look, it has to be me because I'm left-handed. They're not going to check my side. He has to rally these armies of Israel. He has to give them the sign. When I blow the trumpet,
horn,
right,
be
that's
there.
when we're going to go. And so the Bible kind of leaves these stories out. But realistically, Ehud is probably planning this assassination and this attack on the Moabites for at least a year, if not more, that of planning that needs to go into this.
Yep. So he can be
how this
there with the
happens.
tribute, and
Right.
you have to have time to, collect the tribute, which is probably set down by Eglon. And so Ehud says, I'll take it. He
Yep.
volunteers. He says, now here's what's going to happen. You guys all know when you hear the trumpet, you'll know that I have accomplished my task.
Yep.
If you don't hear the trumpet, you know the plan went south,
Yes.
right? So this is what's set up, and so the Israelites are ready to rally as soon as they hear that trumpet blow.
Yep. And this is typical of books of history that are just recounting the important facts of
Yes.
the thing, right?
Yes.
So yes, the Bible could have recorded all the minutia that goes into the planning of this, but they don't really tell you the exact story. And so this is one of the things that lends credibility to the Bible as an actual fact, is that it follows those kind of like books of history, like the way that it's written. It doesn't tell you that Ehud was planning for years in this thing, because it just assumes them out of telling this story. What it's doing is it's trying to show you how Ehud, with the Spirit of God, is able to overcome and throw out this person. And it's just, we're going to see a lot of that through this book, that the Bible isn't going to tell us every minute detail of things. Now, some stories it goes into a little stronger. Particularly, we see with Samson, we see a lot,
and Gideon.
We see a lot of that minutia. But we're going to have a lot of judges that simply, it's going to tell us the overview. And in fact, our next judge.
Well, let's finish this.
Is a grand example.
So
yes, we'll finish Ehud out, but he's a grand example of that.
Ehud blows the trumpet, and the Israelite armies come down out of the hills, and he's a very good strategic thinker, because the first thing he does is he secures the fords on the Jordan River, because on one side of the Jordan River is Israel's side, and on the other side is the escape into Moab. And so he secures the fords of the Jordan River so the enemy armies cannot escape.
Mm-hmm.
So now they are basically trapped between two Israelite forces. And as they're attempting to cross the river, of course, the Israelites are striking them down now.
Which is why no one escaped.
And it says these were all mighty men, 10,000, all vigorous and strong, which could also be plotted. It's this is 10,000 men, stout men of valor, which literally is fat or well fed, because they were living off that tribute too. So yeah, they might have been stout men of valor, but maybe they weren't in the best physical shape because of their complacency, thinking the Israelites are never going to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ehud, having his forces ready when they came down, it said, okay, he tells them, the Lord's given Moab into your hands. So they follow him. They take possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab, and they didn't allow anybody to cross over. Well, if you're a Moabite, you want to get out, right?
Yep.
Okay. And the quickest way is to head straight east, cross the Jordan River at the fords, and boom, and in about another 10, 15 miles, you're deep inside Moab. And all of a sudden you get to the water where you got to cross, and
God has a message for them
God has
too.
a message for you too. And this is, they struck down 10,000 of the Moabites. 10,000.
That's a lot.
And
That's
this
big
was
army.
probably one day's battle, maybe two.
It's a big army.
It's a big army, and that's a lot of people, to one sword thrust at a time.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I mean, think of like a football stadium that we have today. That sits like 36,000 people, right?
Yeah.
So a third of that are fighting with swords and spears and arrows and slings, and that's just on the Moabite side,
Right.
And not to mention, so we're talking a football stadium of chaos.
Yep.
That, yes.
And so in the end, now Moab is broken. Its military might is broken. Its king is gone, and it became was made subject to Israel. Well, of course, again, we said nature abhors a vacuum, so now the leadership and the military and everybody that's in charge in Moab is gone. So now the Israelites are in charge.
Yep.
And now you're working for the Israelites instead of the other way around.
Yep.
But even though they're subdued and they're made subject to the Israelites,
they still...
And
peace only lasts 80 years.
It only lasts 80 years. That's probably a generation and a half, maybe two. But the thing to look at here is that influence is still there.
Yep.
Because it doesn't say Moab was eradicated or wiped out. It says they're made subject to.
Mm-hmm.
So now they're still right there. You have the Moabites and the Israelites right next to each other. And the culture's rubbing off.
Yep.
And on that day, Moab is made subject, and the land has peace for 80 years, which would probably be the length of Ehud's life, where he's there and he can judge and
Yep.
and command things, just like Othniel.
Mm-hmm.
And he dies, and the cycle repeats.
And then again, the Israelites did evil on the side of the Lord.
Yep.
And then we get Shamgar.
Shamgar, he's the great one. He's one we got a whole lot of information on.
After Ehud came Shamgar, son of Enoth, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. Mighty Shamgar. So an ox goad is really just a cattle prod.
It's cattle prod. Yep.
It's kind of like a short spear.
Yep.
It's a pointy stick. So him killing 600 people with an ox goad is definitely a feat that is worthy of applying a miracle to. Right.
Yep.
This is not something that should have the endurance to do so. I wouldn't think even a forged iron sword would have the endurance to kill 600 people, let alone an ox goad, but also accounting 600 kills to one individual. This is a miracle of God. God is clearly with Shamgar when he is performing this act of war. Now, we get very, very little about Shamgar, and we will about
but
some
there's
other
a lot
judges.
of things you can draw from this. First of all, he's using an ox goad, so that would obviously tell me that
he's probably a farmer.
This guy is not a military dude.
He is not.
He's a cattle herder or a farmer. So he hasn't been trained in warfare. He goes up against the Philistines, which at this time were probably one of Israel's most persistent and technically competent.
Yes.
enemies. These guys were really good at war.
Well,
They had a trained army, and these dudes were drilled and trained and
David is
practiced.
fighting the Philistines.
David fought him. Saul fought him. And
so
David.
We're talking hundreds of years that Israel is dealing with the Philistines.
And so this guy who is a farmer shows up with his ox goad that he used for moving the cows around in and out of the corral and the pastures and stuff, or pulling things, and he makes the Philistines look totally ridiculous.
Yes.
He kills 600 of them.
Yes.
Boom, done.
Yeah, I might as well say he had a shovel in his hand.
Yeah,
He killed
it's not
600
even a
people with
weapon.
it. Right, it's not.
So he's not a trained warrior. He's a farmer who, in strength supplied by God, then performs his assigned mission, and a superhuman feat, actually,
Yes.
is what it comes down to. Because
Absolutely.
I'm going up against guys with swords, spears, and shields, and all I got is an ox goad. And what do you think my chances are of getting 2, let alone 600?
Your chances probably 0.
Probably 0 of even getting 1. And boom, there's 600 here drop, and that's it. Now we don't know if he's doing this during the time of Ehud.
Yeah, well, it says after Ehud.
Ehud, date-wise or something like that. It's presumably after Ehud.
Yeah, but it doesn't give us direct dates, so
it doesn't. But
it's open to sort of some kind of interpretation, for sure.
The implication here is as wow, and he's mentioned later on in chapter 5. In verse 6, just in passing, on the Song of Deborah and Barak, but this is quite the deal here for this guy.
Yeah.
Obviously, it has to be superhuman strength provided by God for him to be able.
Well, it's very similar to David's story, right? Like he is,
and Goliath.
Yeah. He's this shepherd who
shows up with a sling and a shepherd's.
Yeah, and just relying completely on God, and he overcomes this great odds, and so it's very, very similar to that.
He picked up 5 stones and
particular
he
story.
only needed 1.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
He brought Goliath down, and then I'll bet he could probably barely pick up Goliath's sword when he cut off his head.
Probably. The Bible describes it
so
as
there we go.
monstrous.
We get the first 3 judges of Israel. We get the right man for the job, Othniel. We get the irregular Ehud, and then we get one who, for lack of a better term, because of what we don't know, he's just a rank outsider. He's just somebody that pops up out of nowhere that God uses. And one of the things we need to understand about this for us is that you don't have to be anybody particular, anybody great, anybody super knowledgeable or anything like that. God can and will use you if you allow it and you're open to it. And that's a message especially for believers, for Christians, for followers of Jesus, is that you don't have to have anything special, and God can take and use you and do something great if you're willing to allow it. He won't force you, but if you're willing, that's what he wants you for. And if more people in the church would develop that attitude and humble themselves to that point of, Lord, use me, I'll do what you want, he'll do it. And big things can happen. And big things will happen. And you may not think it's a lot, but In the eyes of God, it is. And that's what we as believers need to understand. You don't have to be a regular person. You can be a lefty like me. You can be the man for the job like William. You can be just an outsider coming in and randomly meeting somebody on the street that you've never met and just offering one word of hope or kindness, sometimes even a smile. And that'll make a whole difference, Taking time to smile at a stranger has saved lives because maybe that person was getting ready to do themselves in. And just somebody smiling at them changed their whole outlook at that moment and stopped them from carrying out that desire. We're running out of time. Next week we're going to get into some of the bigger names. We're going to have some fun with it too. Read the book ahead, study it, look at it, and think about how ways God can use you. And we'll be with you again next week. Thank you for joining us. Good night, and God bless you.